St. Mary-Glees, the American paratroopers found they were dropped directly into a German battalion. As they parachuted down to the ground, they were easily picked off by the German soldiers with rifle fire. One soldier got caught up with his parachute in the church tower. There is, to this day, a dummy with a parachute hung at the church to remember this event. Over the following hours, the Allied troops made slow and steady progress. They were met with a fierce and tough German defence, and many more casualties were experienced on both sides. The Allied troops pushed on, and more troops landed behind them. Any army going to war like this needed to be supplied with food, water, transport, supplies, ammunition, and backup troops. Ideally, the Allies would have liked to have landed at Cherbourg, a nearby harbour, but their spies had detected that the harbours were particularly well defended. That wasn't an option that would work. With no way of getting thousands of tons of equipment to the fighting men, the leaders knew that the invasion would come to an abrupt end very quickly. The British Prime Minister, Winston Churchill, had commissioned a brilliant invention which had never ever been used in battle before. It was a floatable, ready-made harbour which had been pre-constructed in blocks in the United Kingdom and towed across the English Channel to Normandy. A few days after the landing, the Army engineers positioned the pieces of the two ready-made harbours, called Mulberry Harbours, and assembled them in place. All the time, they were at risk from enemy gunfire. From that time, thousands of tons of equipment and jeeps and tanks were able to drive securely onto the beaches and keep the advancing troops equipped the way they needed. Europe was on the way to being freed from the rule of the man the world came to understand was an evil leader, Adolf Hitler. Mulberry had been a huge structure, and at Arromanches in France today, it's still possible to see large sections of the old harbour lying on the beach and out at sea. On D-Day, 156,000 troops landed on the beach over the first day. They in turn had been supported by no fewer than 195,000 naval personnel. The Allied troops experienced approximately 10,000 casualties, of which about 4,400 were tragically killed. It's estimated that on that day the Germans had about 50,000 troops on defence duty in the region. Of these, it's believed that somewhere between 4,000 and 9,000 became casualties. The defences at the beaches included a huge 170 large coastal artillery guns on top of the individual weapons each army member held. Over the next year, the Allied troops would work their way steadily through Europe, freeing the different countries as they moved along. The 6th of June 1944 is still within living memory for some of our citizens who are now in their 90s. It will forever go down as D-Day, the day when men of the Allied forces showed outstanding courage and bravery. The freedom that the people of Europe have today to make individual choices and come and go as we please was bought by these incredibly brave men who fought for that liberty. Very many of them never got to experience that freedom and paid the ultimate price. Their bravery, courage, and fortitude should never be allowed to be forgotten. In Normandy, gravestones of the Allied troops go on as far as the eye can see at the military graveyards. It's a sobering picture to remind us of how vast the loss of life really was. Saint-Lô, a city devastated by war. The city of Saint-Lô lies just about 30 miles away from the Normandy landing beaches. It was a vitally important city for the Allied forces to capture. It was considered so important that if the Allies weren't able to capture the city, the whole beach landings would have been for nothing. The battle to free the city started on July the 7th, 1944, just about a month after the Normandy landings. It had taken the Allies that long to cover the ground to get there. The city became a victim of the fierce battle that took place there. The fighting was brutal. There's nothing gentle about war. A proud city that had stood for hundreds of years was devastated by the armies scrapping to take control. It took 12 long days for the Allies to seize the city. When this was done, 95% of the buildings were in complete ruins. One of the few buildings that remained still stands there today. The cathedral used to stand majestic and ornate. It was grand, impressive, and with beautiful carvings. Although still standing at the end of the battle, a large amount of the cathedral was destroyed or badly damaged. It now stands as a statue in itself, a statue which represents the ugly truth of war. There are many signs of the violence that had occurred, still visible from bullets, missiles, and shrapnel. Its imperfections stand now as a visual reminder of the devastation that took place. The elegance of the original structure is lost forever, though it's now watertight and usable again. The city has been rebuilt, though many an ancient, beautiful buildings will never be seen again. The freedom from the Nazis came, as always, at a very high price. On the 30th of April 1945, it's understood that Hitler and his wife Eva Braun took to a bunker in Berlin and took their own lives. Hitler was dead. Jewish Holocaust. This film, tracking the journey from D-Day to VE Day, cannot be complete without covering something so hideous, so evil, that the pictures from the scenes are too awful to be shown. They're devastating and deeply, deeply upsetting. As the Allied troops pressed through Europe, racing towards Berlin, which, when taken, was thought to represent the end of the war, they battled their way through towns and cities. They fought street to street, building to building. Bombs, bullets, machine guns, tanks, and the fabric of towns and cities' streets, roads and bridges, they suffered horrendously, just like at St. Lo. During the last days and weeks of the war, the troops came across a number of camps, which came to be known as concentration camps, that soberly focused their attention on the evil and brutality of Hitler's rule. Hitler and his generals despised the Jewish people. They blamed them very unfairly for all the bad things in Europe from before the war. The majority of the German people were unaware of what the German leaders had done. They rounded up Jewish people. They took the families away from their lives, their businesses, their homes, and moved them into dreadful, stark camps. In these hideous camps, the families were separated, wives from husbands, children from parents. Their dignity was totally taken away. As a symbol of this, they were made to wear a dreadful uniform made of striped cloth as a symbol of their humiliation. The Jews were made to work as slave labour in these camps for as long as their bodies held out. They were terribly underfed and looked more like living skeletons than living people. When they were no longer of any use to the camps, they were gathered and brutally murdered. The scale of what the Nazis had done was unknown until well after the war. But the truth is that a total of more than 6 million Jewish people were snatched from their lives and killed in this way. That's right, 6 million. That's the equivalent of killing every single person in numbers that are existing in Denmark today. The Nazis didn't believe that Jewish lives had any value. When the advancing Allied soldiers stumbled across these terrible places, it affected the men who witnessed them for the rest of their lives. They couldn't believe or remotely understand what they had seen. The story of how one Jewish family tried to hide from capture has actually become very famous. It's the story of a quite incredible girl called Anne Frank, who kept a diary of her days, weeks and months, hiding away in a secret annex above a factory in Amsterdam, where she had lived. In total, she stayed in those rooms for just over 2 years. The entrance to the annex was behind a false bookcase, which covered the wall and hid the entrance doorway. Several times the building was searched by soldiers, but the Nazis never guessed the way through. During the daytime, while the factory was at work, they had to remain in perfect silence. If they made a noise, someone in the factory might tell the authorities. They couldn't even use the toilet during these times. In Anne's diary, she kept an account of how she was growing up in these rooms, trapped with another family who also took refuge there. The diary was found after the war and was published into a best-selling book. It's a remarkable story. Sadly, in August 1944, Anne was eventually caught. Somebody, nobody knows who, did tell the authorities, and this time the soldiers' search found them. They were bundled away into the concentration camps. Anne didn't survive the camps. She died sometime between February and March 1945 at Bergen-Belsen concentration camp. She was just 15 years old. Miraculously, her father did survive the camps. When the Allied soldiers reached his camp, he was freed. VE Day. Just about 11 months after D-Day, the German army, who had been fighting against the Allied troops to their west and the Russian army to their east, were finally defeated. On the 8th of May, 1945, the German army signed an unconditional surrender. The day was determined as Victory in Europe Day. For the people of Europe, desperate and battered by 6 terrifying years of war, the war was over, and they had a chance to start rebuilding their lives and their homes again. The Second World War had been the deadliest in history. Some 75 million people lost their lives. This was actually about 3% of the total number of people on planet Earth at that time. A shudderingly awful number. Had it not been for the bravery of all the Allied troops throughout the war, very many more people could have been killed or injured, and countless more would have lost their homes. The people of Europe set about rebuilding their lives and determined that there would never be another war like it. Ever.